The next unit is about instructional conversations. This is an important, let's say, step in our discussion of learning as a social process, because we zoom in on the interaction between the teacher and the students, or a small group of students, basically. I would like to discuss two examples, basically, reciprocal teaching and scaffolding. First, reciprocal teaching. I'd like to zoom in on the study by Brown and Palingsar, which is already back in the 80s of the last century, because it's a relevant study in the context of our questions about learning as a social process, but also because of the methodology. It's really a seminal study, and I hope I can explain why it is so important. Well, let's start with an explanation of the original study, then an example, then some review data on this methodology, and then another example by Ellen Schoenfeld. The original study is about reading comprehension for 12-year-old students. Students with an average technical reading ability, but students who are 2 years behind in reading comprehension. So a really problematic group, 12-year-olds, weak reading comprehension skills, and the focus, of course, of the intervention is to improve their reading comprehension skills. Brown and Palingsar decided to work with groups of 2 to 7 children with one teacher, small groups, so there's a really intense interaction is possible. These these groups of students read an expository text paragraph by paragraph, and the text is also new for the teacher. So also the teacher reads the text with the student paragraph by paragraph, and the whole purpose of the intervention is to improve 4 skills based on reading each paragraph separately. So summarizing a paragraph, formulating questions about a paragraph, which helps the students to focus on what is central, or what is basic, and what is essential in the paragraph. Seek clarifications when students are confused, when there are problems with understanding the paragraph, and then making a prediction about the next paragraph. Now, initially in this intervention, the teacher is the one who explains and models and actually shows how these 4 skills are applied. But gradually the students take over. They take turns in leading the discussion about a paragraph. We will see an example of this intervention in a minute. So you basically understand what the approach is about. There's a small group of students, there's a teacher, there's a text, an expository text. The text is read paragraph by paragraph, and the teacher models the strategies of summarizing a paragraph, formulating questions, focusing on the essential parts of the paragraph, highlighting things which are not clear in the paragraph, and making a prediction about the next paragraph, what the content of the next paragraph should be. Now, first, a bit about the methodology, which is the interesting thing about this study. What Brown and Palingsar did, they started to provide the training, the interventions themselves. So they were the teachers, the researchers were the teachers. And they experienced with this approach, collected, of course, data which had to do with the performance of the students in the classroom after or during and after finishing the training. So on regular, reading comprehension tests taken, administered in the classroom. So first, Brown and Palingsar were the teachers themselves, and they measured the results of their approach. Then they taught their approach. They trained, Brown and Palingsar trained other teachers to actually execute the same intervention, so to be the teacher in these small groups. And as a third step, these teachers actually trained other teachers to do the same, so to implement the intervention of Brauner-Pelingsar. So you have a sort of cascading effect. First, the authors as teachers, then the second step, other teachers trained by the authors, and then as a third step, and again another group of teachers trained by the teachers who were originally trained by the authors. Now, and what they measured was a constant, improving effect. I can show you some data about that. You see here percentage correct scores on classroom reading comprehension tests. First the baseline, then after the first half of the training, then after the second half of the training, then a maintenance test immediately after having finished the training, and then a follow-up test 8 weeks after having finished the training. There are 2 experimental groups and 2 control groups. The experimental groups, the RT groups, the reciprocal training groups, classes in social studies and science, and again the control groups in social studies and science. And you can see a gradual increase in performance with the reciprocal teaching groups. So they were really improving, ending up between 60 and 70%, starting with 20% correct answers, and there was a small decline, but not a very an important decline. I'm not sure whether it was a significant decline. You have to find that in the original paper. But there's a clear and clear-cut difference between the reciprocal teaching groups and the control groups. Okay, so this is the picture which holds for all replication studies done by Pelingsar and Brown afterwards, and they are nicely reported in the papers I've made references to. Okay. So to have a better idea, a small example here of an interaction between a teacher and the group of students. The students are labeled C and A and T and L and K, etc., and the teacher is labeled T with an asterisk. Okay, so the first paragraph is I just read it for you. In the United States, salt is produced by 3 basic methods: sun evaporation, solar evaporation by the sun, mining, and artificial heat evaporation. For salt to be extracted by solar evaporation, the weather must be hot and dry. Thus, solar salt is harvested in the tropic-like areas along our southern ocean coasts and at Great Salt Lake. So that's the first paragraph. Then the first student raises or formulates a question about this paragraph. What would be a good question, in a test, in a reading comprehension test, about this paragraph? And the student formulates the questions as such: name 3 different basic methods how salt is produced. And then another student gives the answer: evaporation, mining, evaporation, artificial heat evaporation. And then the first student says, correct, very good. My summary on this paragraph is about ways that salt is being produced. And then the teacher gives the comment, very good. Could you select the next teacher, the reciprocal teaching story? Okay, the student selects another student, and then the next paragraph is read. The second oldest form of salt production is mining. Unlike early methods that made the work extremely dangerous and difficult, today's methods use special machinery, and salt mining is easier and safer. The old expression, back to the salt mine, no longer applies. Okay, and then the next teacher, the student teacher, I must say, formulates a question about this paragraph. Name 2 words that often describe mining salt in the old days. 2 words. Okay, and then another student formulates an answer, back to the salt mines. And then the student teacher says, no, Angela. And Angela answers, dangerous and difficult. And then the student teacher gives his feedback correct or her feedback correct. This paragraph is all about comparing the old mining of salt and today's mining of salt. So that's the summary. The teacher reacts, beautiful. And then the teacher-student gives a prediction. I have a prediction to make. Good. And then the student says, I think it might tell when salt was first discovered. Well, it might tell what salt is made of and how it's made. Okay, the teacher gives a command, okay, and then asks for the next teacher. So this is, it gives you an idea about this reciprocal teaching approach. Okay, we just went into that. Rosenschein and Meister did a review study on studies which adopted this approach. 19 studies they found in 1992, and they found supportive evidence in these 19 studies. With the two commands on the approach. The first command is that a pre-dialogue instruction on the 4 strategies does help, so it helps the student to actually practice the strategies in the dialogue, in the reciprocal teaching dialogue. So some training beforehand does make the reciprocal teaching sessions more effective. And the training should be continued for a longer period of time, at least a week to a month and a half. So it's not a matter of 1 or 2 sessions. You have to practice this approach, developing these 4 strategies during a considerable amount of time, and then you may see effects. Okay, that does make sense. Again, it is a very nice study, and I also I remind you of the approach. First the authors, then the first layer of teachers, and then the second layer of teachers. Okay, now I just briefly refer to Alan Schoenfeld, who also worked in this area. So we are talking about constructivist approaches to studying, teaching and learning in the classroom with authentic learning tasks and also in a social environment, of course. That's characteristic, of course, of the constructivist approach. I already mentioned Schoenfeld, but now some details about his approach. He was a researcher, a successful researcher, and also a math teacher. And he used, of course, his own experience as a math teacher to develop his ideas about mathematical problem solving and teaching and learning in general. As a math teacher, he asked students to come up with difficult math problems in a particular subject in the math curriculum. So Schoenfeld asked for these problems. Of course, you can easily envisage that students really try to find very hard problems for the teacher to solve. Schoenfeld started to solve these problems just in front of the classroom by thinking aloud. So the problems were new for him. He started to work on them. And he showed how he approached these problems. And as I already mentioned, he not only paid attention to the subject matter area of math, the math curriculum, but also to what he called the heuristic strategies, the planning strategies, the learning strategies, etc. So these metacognitive strategies were also very, very, very relevant in his approach. And he did pay a lot of attention to these metacognitive skills in order to solve the problems. So that was one thing. And again, this is reciprocal because the teacher acts as a student here, solving by thinking aloud complex math problems. In a second learning environment, Schoenfeld helped small groups of students who were working on a project or solving complex mathematical problems. And he helped them just by posing 3 questions. So by raising their awareness, their metacognitive awareness of what they were doing. The first question is, what are you doing, basically? The second question was, why did you choose this approach? And a third question was, is your approach successful? So these questions did not provide an answer to the problems the students were working on, that helped them to become aware of their approach and of the successfulness of their approach. So that's also a nice example, and already a bridge, I must say, to the second example in this unit of instructional conversations, which is about scaffolding. Okay, scaffolding is a concept which arose in the area of activity theory, as we call it, which is actually the area which is a follow-up on the work of Vygotsky. Well, first, some characteristics of scaffolding. This is a figure from a paper by Janneke van der Pol, Monique Volman, and myself. It's a good review study, a decade of research on scaffolding and student-teacher interaction. And what you see here is a sort of, machine, you might say. You have the teacher and the student here, and again, here the teacher and the student in a sort of second time slice, so to speak. So in the first moment during the scaffolding procedure, the teacher provides a lot of support, and the student has not much responsibility for completing a particular task. And the teacher and the student interact by, this is the typical, sort of interaction we have already seen as in the model by Nelson and Narens about metacognition. So there is a control and a monitoring loop, so to speak. The teacher, that's the control loop, the scaffolding loop here. The teacher applies diagnostic strategies and also scaffolding strategies, and the student provides responses which help the teacher to tune his or her intervention to the particular needs of the student. So this is the first moment during the scaffolding procedure, and this is, let's say, the last moment. And as you can see, the support of the teacher is gradually fading, and the responsibility for the task is gradually increasing for the student, I must say. And that does remind us, of course, of the 4 steps we have discussed in Vygotsky's zone of proximal development approach, where first the teacher is responsible and leads the student, and gradually the student takes over the lead and is in fact responsible for the problem-solving process in the end, as you can remember, of course, from the first unit in this module. Okay, so this is a sort of analysis of the concept of scaffolding, and I now return to the original work by Wood and Brunner and Ross, standing in the Vygotskyan tradition, as I said, in which it is emphasized that scaffolding helps students because complexity is reduced. Well, that does remind us of the concept of scaffolding as it is, as it is used in the construction environment. A building is being erected, is constructed, and scaffolds around the building keep everything in its own place and support the building because it's weak, during the construction process. But eventually, as the building has been completed, it's strong, and the scaffolds can gradually be taken away, put down, because the building is strong enough to stand on its own. So that metaphor is the metaphor which is also used here in the educational setting. So scaffolding is, by these authors, is defined as enabling a child to solve a problem beyond his or her unassisted efforts. Here we have the zone of proximal development. By controlling those elements that are initially beyond the learner's capacity, and thus permitting him to concentrate upon those elements that are within his range of competence. So things that are beyond the learner's capacity are too complex, are taken over by the teacher, and things that can be done by the student are done by the student. Another interesting statement: comprehension of the solution must precede production. So first, the student has to understand a problem-solving procedure, and then the student, as a next step, can provide the procedure, the solution to a particular problem on his or her own, after having grasped, the meaning of this approach. Well-executed scaffolding begins by luring the child into actions that produce recognizable for him solutions. So help the student to do what he can or what she can do, and gradually build up, the complexity, build up the student's autonomous and independent skills to solve a particular problem. That's the basic idea. Okay, so that's where the concept of scaffolding comes from. Now I focus again on the work of Janneke van der Pol, who did a very brilliant study, I must say, in teaching scaffolding in small group work. That's her thesis, and it has been published in various places, for instance in the Journal of the Learning Sciences. Now the important thing of Janneke van der Pol's approach is that, as you can see in this model, scaffolding does not start with intervening, but scaffolding starts with asking questions. And that's what teachers usually do not do. Whenever students are stuck and ask for help, the teacher tends to provide the solution. For instance, when somebody is stuck and working on a particular computer program or doesn't know what to do, the teacher walks to the screen and just pushes the buttons which are necessary for the continuation of the work. So without further questioning. And that's exactly what scaffolding should not be. Scaffolding should not be the immediate provision of solution steps, but scaffolding should start with questions. And the questions are directed towards identifying the problem as it is encountered by the student or the group of students. So it does remind us of Schoenfeld's questions, what are you doing and are you successful, etc., etc. So these diagnostic questions help the teacher to understand the problem the students are confronted with, but also it helps the students to understand what the mess is they are at the moment in. So it helps both the teacher and the student, these diagnostic strategies. It is a matter of interaction, so there's a question and an answer, and then there's a checking again of the diagnosis and an answer by the student. And when the teacher is completely certain that he or she does understand the student's problem, then the teacher might choose an adaptive intervention strategy to help the student to take the next step. The student does indicate whether he or she understands, or the group does understand, and then there is the next step, and there's a checking whether that step actually has been successfully taken. So the teacher does follow up on the intervention strategy and looks after the continuation of the work by the students. Okay, so that is the cyclist, which is called the scaffolding model by Janneke van der Pol, and which has been tried out in various circumstances, and teachers have been trained to apply this model, this scaffolding approach, and successfully. So I think this is a very good example of a successful teacher-student conversation which takes place and which is really interesting in the domain of learning as a social process.